Picture a single house on a quiet Colorado street, a home where 12 children once lived, laughed, and played together. Now imagine that same house decades later, with 6 of those children lost forever to madness. 2 died by their own hands, and the remaining siblings were scattered like broken glass across a country that refuses to acknowledge the truth of what really happened behind those pristine white walls. This is not a work of fiction. This is not a movie plot. This is the documented, terrifying reality of Hidden Valley Road in Colorado Springs, where the Galvin family became the most intensely studied case of genetic mental illness in American history, and where the very meaning of sanity was tested to its absolute breaking point. Before we go deeper into the story of the Galvin family and their descent into a nightmare that medical science is still struggling to comprehend, I need you to click that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which state you're watching from, because what happened to this family could happen to anyone, anywhere, and the implications of their story will stay with you long after this video is over. What you are about to hear challenges everything we believe we understand about the human mind, the bonds of family, and the fragile line between normal life and total psychological collapse. The year was 1945, and America was intoxicated with victory. The Second World War had ended. The economy was surging, and young couples everywhere were finally ready to build the families they had dreamed of during those dark war years. Among them was Donald Galvin, a tall, handsome Air Force officer with steel gray eyes and an unshakable belief in duty, discipline, and the American way of life. He had just married Mimi Blay, a beautiful and intelligent woman from a prosperous Texas family, who shared his vision of creating something extraordinary together. The newly married couple settled in Colorado Springs, where the clean mountain air and vast blue skies appeared to promise endless opportunities. Donald's position at the Air Force Academy was respected and secure, while Mimi embraced her role as the perfect military wife with a nearly frightening determination. She was resolved to build not just a house, but a masterpiece of American family life that would be the envy of every neighbor on their street, and build they did. Between 1945 and 1965, Mimi gave birth to 12 children in quick succession, 10 boys and 2 girls. The oldest, Donald Jr., arrived in 1945, followed by James, John, Brian, Michael, Richard, Joseph, Mark, Matthew, Peter, Margaret, and finally, Mary in 1965. To anyone looking from the outside, the Galvin household on Hidden Valley Road seemed like an image taken straight from a Norman Rockwell painting. The children were good-looking, athletic, and academically skilled. Donald Sr. coached Little League and was honored as Father of the Year by a local civic group. Mimi organized elaborate family trips to the ballet, the opera, and the symphony, making certain her children were as cultured as they were accomplished. But even in those early years, there were indications that something in this paradise was not right. Mimi's drive for perfection was almost an obsession. She maintained meticulous records of every detail of her children's lives, from their school grades to their social lives. The rules of the house were strict and merciless, and any step out of line from Mimi's demanding standards was met with immediate punishment. Donald Sr., when he was home from his frequent military duties, seemed to live in a separate world from his wife and children, more like a commanding officer conducting periodic reviews than a father involved in the daily turmoil of family life. The children learned from an early age to show a united front to the outside world, to never reveal the growing tensions within their home, and to shield each other from their parents' increasingly unpredictable behavior. They did not yet realize that they were all part of an experiment that was gradually spinning out of control, or that some of them carried within their very DNA the seeds of their own ruin. Donald Jr. was everything his parents could have wished for and more. Tall, athletic, and incredibly handsome, he succeeded at every sport he attempted and earned top marks without seeming to try. His teachers adored him. His classmates looked up to him, and his younger siblings idolized him. When he finished high school and was awarded a full scholarship to Colorado State University, the whole family celebrated what appeared to be the first of many great successes to come. But college life turned out to be different from the controlled world of Hidden Valley Road, and during his first year, Donald Jr. began to show signs of strain. His roommates noticed strange habits. He would remain awake for days on end, walking the dormitory halls and talking to himself about hidden messages in his textbooks. He became certain that his professors were secretly evaluating him for a special government program, and that his telephone was being bugged by federal agents who had recognized his extraordinary talents. The final breaking point happened during a campus bonfire event in the fall of 1963. Without any warning or reason, Donald Jr. tore off his shirt and jumped directly into the flames. Fellow students pulled him out, suffering from serious burns on his arms and chest. But when campus officials tried to question him about the event, he could only gaze at them with an empty expression and whisper about purification rituals and messages from the spirits of the fire. The event was quickly kept quiet. Donald Sr. used his military contacts to make sure no police report was made and no story appeared in the newspaper. Donald Jr. was quietly taken out of the university and brought back to Hidden Valley Road, where Mimi persuaded herself that her oldest son was merely dealing with the stress of being away from his family for the first time. She prescribed rest, proper food, and the healing power of family affection. But Donald Jr.'s behavior continued to worsen. He would vanish for hours, only to be discovered standing completely still in the family's backyard, looking up at the sky with a look of intense concentration. When his siblings attempted to speak with him, he would answer with long, rambling speeches about secret codes hidden in the shapes of clouds and the voices of ancient warriors speaking to him from the mountains. On one especially disturbing occasion, his young sister Margaret discovered him in the garage, methodically choking the family cat while tears ran down his face. "It told me to," he explained when challenged, his voice dull and without emotion. "It said it was the only way to stop the messages." The family existed in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing which version of Donald Jr. they would face from one day to the next. Sometimes he seemed almost normal, charming and well-spoken as he had always been, but more and more, those moments were replaced by bouts of violence, paranoia, and behavior so strange that even his devoted mother could no longer pretend that rest and family love would be enough to repair whatever was shattered inside her perfect firstborn son. In 1965, Donald Jr. married a kind, innocent young woman named June, who had fallen in love with the charming, handsome man she met during one of his short periods of seeming normality. The wedding was a lavish event, with Mimi doing everything possible to create the kind of celebration that would strengthen the Galvin family's reputation as Colorado Springs royalty. But the marriage was cursed from the beginning. June quickly found that her new husband was not the man she believed she had married. Donald Jr.'s paranoid delusions grew stronger after the wedding, and he became convinced that June was part of a complex plot to watch and control him. He would accuse her of poisoning his meals, interfering with his things, and communicating with his enemies through secret hand signals. When she tried to talk sense into him or get help from his family, he would explode in anger that left her shaking and covered in bruises. The violence increased steadily over the next 2 years. Donald Jr. would disappear for days at a time, only to come back with wild tales about government agents, alien kidnappings, and messages from God. During one particularly frightening event, he became certain that June was not actually his wife, but a replacement sent to take the place of the real June, who he believed had been taken and killed. He spent a whole night questioning her, insisting that she prove who she was by answering more and more impossible questions about their shared past. The end came on a cold February night in 1967. June had finally found the courage to tell Donald Jr. that she was leaving him, that she could not live in fear any longer. His reaction was immediate and horrifying. He left the house without a word and came back an hour later, holding a small bottle of pills he had somehow gotten from a local pharmacy. Cyanide capsules, he explained calmly, enough to kill them both quickly and without pain. We will die together, he told her, his eyes shining with a terrible excitement. And then we will be free from all of this forever. June's survival instincts kicked in with a strength that surprised even her. She managed to escape from Donald Jr.'s grasp and ran screaming into the night, banging on neighbors' doors until someone called the police. When the officers got to the house, they found Donald Jr. sitting calmly at the kitchen table, the bottle of cyanide pills arranged neatly in front of him like dinner place settings. He was arrested and committed to the Colorado State Hospital in Pueblo, where he received his first official diagnosis: paranoid schizophrenia. The doctors explained to his shattered parents that their oldest son was suffering from a severe mental illness that had no known cure and an uncertain future. The best they could hope for was that medication and therapy might help manage his symptoms and stop further violent episodes. But this was only the start of the Galvin family's nightmare. As Donald Jr. started his long journey through the mental health system, his younger brothers were entering adolescence and young adulthood, carrying inside them the same genetic time bombs that had already ruined their older brother's life. James, the second oldest Galvin son, had always lived in Donald Jr.'s shadow, desperately seeking the approval and attention that seemed to come so easily to his older brother. He was smart and gifted in his own way, with a special talent for music and a sharp sense of humor that could make even his stern father laugh. But as Donald Jr.'s illness became impossible to ignore, James found himself pushed into the role of the family's new golden boy, a position he was neither ready for nor able to handle. The pressure of becoming the family's hope for salvation, while watching his beloved older brother vanish into insanity, proved to be more than James could take. By his final year of high school, he was displaying signs of the same frightening decline that had destroyed Donald Jr.'s promising future. He became fixated on the idea that he was being watched and followed, that his teachers and classmates were all part of a complex scheme to drive him insane. Just like his brother, James' break from reality was slower than Donald Jr.'s dramatic collapse, but it was no less devastating. He started to pull away from his friends and activities, spending long hours locked in his room, writing page after page of nonsensical notes about secret messages and hidden meanings. When family members tried to enter his room, they would find the walls covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and hand-drawn diagrams connected by strings and pins in patterns that made sense only to James' increasingly broken mind. The violence started with self-harm. James would smash his head against the walls until his forehead was bloody and swollen, explaining to anyone who asked that he was trying to silence the voices that never gave him peace. He carved symbols into his arms and chest with kitchen knives, claiming that the marks were protective charms that would stop the government agents from reading his thoughts. When his worried mother tried to take the knives away, James became violent for the first time, hitting her across the face with a force that left her stunned. But it was James' behavior toward his younger siblings that showed the true depths of his sickness and cruelty. As his paranoid delusions grew stronger, he began to single out the family's youngest members, especially his little sisters, Margaret and Mary, as targets for his twisted experiments and sexual fantasies. He would trap them when their parents were not home, forcing them to take part in bizarre rituals that he claimed would shield them from the evil forces trying to annihilate the family. The abuse grew steadily worse, becoming more violent and sexual in nature as James' hold on reality slipped further away. Margaret and Mary learned to hide when they heard his footsteps in the hallway, to lock their bedroom doors, and crawl under their beds when his voice took on that particular tone that meant he was having one of his episodes. But there was nowhere in the house that was truly safe from James' attention, and their parents seemed either unable or unwilling to recognize what was happening under their own roof. The family's fall into chaos sped up as James' behavior became more and more unpredictable and dangerous. He would vanish for days, only to return with stories about secret missions and underground organizations that existed only in his shattered imagination. During one particularly alarming episode, he became convinced that the family dog was a government spy and tried to perform surgery on the animal to remove what he believed were hidden recording devices. As the 1970s began, the Galvin household had become something that would have been unrecognizable to the neighbors who had once admired their seeming perfection. Two of the oldest sons were now moving in and out of mental institutions, their violent eruptions and bizarre behavior making it impossible for them to live at home for long stretches. But their temporary absences brought no peace to Hidden Valley Road, because the madness appeared to be spreading through the family like a contagious disease. Brian, the fourth son, started showing symptoms during his junior year of high school. Unlike his older brothers, whose breaks from reality had been gradual, Brian's descent into madness was rapid and horrifying. He became convinced that he had supernatural abilities and that he had been selected by dark forces to complete a special mission that would alter the course of human history. He spent hours looking at himself in mirrors, practicing what he called his transformation rituals, and speaking in voices that did not sound like his own. The violence that came from Brian was different from his brother's calculated cruelty. Where Donald Jr. and James had been systematic in their madness, Brian was explosive and unpredictable. He would fly into rages without warning, attacking family members with whatever weapons were nearby: kitchen knives, baseball bats, his own fists and feet. During one especially terrifying event, he chased his younger brother Mark through the house with a hunting rifle, screaming that Mark was an imposter who had taken the place of his real brother and needed to be eliminated before he could finish his evil mission. The family called the police that night for the first time, but when the officers arrived, Brian had already calmed down and was sitting peacefully in the living room, reading a book as if nothing had happened. He smiled politely at the policemen and answered their questions with such apparent honesty and normality that they left convinced there had been some sort of misunderstanding. Only the family knew that this calm exterior was just another mask that Brian wore between episodes, and that the violence would return as inevitably as the sun rises. But it was Joseph, the seventh son, whose illness showed itself in the most disturbing and unexplainable ways. Joseph had always been one of the quieter Galvin children, thoughtful and inward-looking in a family full of big personalities. But as he entered his teenage years, his quiet nature took on a sinister quality that made even his toughened family members uneasy in his presence. Joseph claimed to see things that were not there: shadowy figures moving through the house at night, faces looking in through windows, messages written in blood on walls that appeared clean to everyone else. He would stand for hours in the backyard, staring up at the sky and having lively conversations with invisible companions who he insisted were more real than his own family members. The truly chilling part of Joseph's illness was his seeming ability to predict future events with uncanny accuracy. He would announce that someone was going to call just seconds before the phone rang, or warn family members about accidents that would happen exactly as he described them. His siblings began to avoid him, not because of violent outbursts like his brothers, but because his presence made them feel as if they were being watched by something that was not completely human. During one unforgettable incident, Joseph approached his younger sister Mary and told her in a flat, emotionless voice that she needed to stay away from the basement for the next 3 days because the shadow people were angry about the noise upstairs. When Mary asked what he meant, Joseph simply stared at her with eyes that seemed to look right through her and repeated his warning before walking away. 3 days later, a water pipe burst in the basement, flooding the entire area and causing thousands of dollars in damage. By 1973, the Galvin family was living in a state of perpetual emergency. 6 of the 10 boys had now been diagnosed with various forms of mental illness, primarily schizophrenia, and the house on Hidden Valley Road had become a revolving door of hospitalizations, police visits, and increasingly desperate attempts to keep up some appearance of normal family life. Mimi had aged decades in the space of a few years. Her once perfect appearance was now tired and worn from the constant strain of managing multiple mentally ill children while trying to protect the ones who were still healthy. She had become obsessed with finding someone to blame for the catastrophe that had struck her family, cycling through theories about everything from environmental poisons to government experiments to curses placed on the family by envious neighbors. Donald Sr. had withdrawn almost completely from family life, spending longer and longer periods away on military assignments and maintaining a cold military demeanor even when he was home. He refused to discuss his son's illnesses with anyone, including his wife, and seemed to see their mental breakdowns as personal failures that reflected badly on his ability to keep discipline and order in his own household. The two youngest daughters, Margaret and Mary, had become like refugees in their own home, constantly aware of danger and ready to escape at the first sign of one of their brothers having an episode. They had learned to sleep with chairs wedged against their bedroom doors and to keep emergency bags packed with clothes and money hidden under their beds in case they needed to run away in the middle of the night. The breaking point came when Brian, in the grip of one of his most severe psychotic episodes, became convinced that his girlfriend Nancy was actually a demon sent to seduce and destroy him. He had been dating Nancy for several months, and she represented one of the few normal, healthy relationships in his increasingly chaotic life. But as his paranoid delusions grew stronger, he began to see her presence as proof of a vast supernatural conspiracy aimed directly at him. On a cold November evening in 1973, Brian invited Nancy to dinner at a restaurant near the university where they were both students. She arrived expecting a normal date, perhaps even hoping that Brian would finally open up to her about the strange behavior she had been noticing in recent weeks. Instead, she found herself face to face with someone who was no longer the gentle, thoughtful young man she had fallen in love with. Brian spent the entire dinner staring at Nancy with an intensity that made her deeply uneasy, occasionally muttering under his breath about signs and omens that only he could see. When she tried to make conversation, he would answer with cryptic remarks about the true nature of reality and the dangers of trusting appearances. By the time they left the restaurant, Nancy was seriously thinking about ending their relationship, not because she didn't care about Brian, but because she was starting to fear for her own safety. What happened next shocked even a family that had become used to violence and madness. Brian drove Nancy to a remote area outside of town, where he attacked her with a hunting knife he had hidden in his car. The assault was swift and brutal, driven not by anger or passion, but by Brian's absolute belief that he was performing a necessary exorcism that would save both their souls from eternal damnation. Nancy died within minutes, and Brian, suddenly calm and seemingly rational, called the police himself to report what he had done. When the officers arrived, they found him sitting beside Nancy's body, covered in blood, but speaking in the polite, articulate way that had always characterized the Galvin children in public. "I had to stop her," he explained matter-of-factly. She wasn't really Nancy anymore. The thing that was wearing her face was going to destroy everything good in the world, starting with me and my family. Ryan was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But before the case could go to trial, he was found dead in his jail cell, having used bed sheets to hang himself from the cell's light fixture. His suicide note was a rambling, almost illegible manifesto about secret wars between cosmic forces and his role as a chosen warrior in the battle between good and evil. The local newspaper covered Nancy's murder and Brian's suicide as a tragic case of young love gone wrong. with no mention of the Galvin family's history of mental illness or the pattern of violence that had been building for years. But within the family, Brian's death marked the moment when any attempt at a normal life finally fell apart completely. News of the Galvin family's extraordinary situation eventually reached the attention of Dr. Lindy Lisi, a pioneering psychiatric researcher who was convinced that schizophrenia had a genetic component that could be identified and studied. At a time when most mental health professionals believed that schizophrenia was caused by bad parenting or environmental factors, DeLisi's focus on genetics was considered radical and controversial. When DeLisi first heard about a Colorado family with 6 schizophrenic sons, she was initially skeptical. Cases of multiple family members developing schizophrenia were rare enough that many researchers dismissed them as statistical anomalies or misdiagnoses. But as she reviewed the available medical records and spoke with the doctors who had treated the Galvin boys over the years, she became convinced that this family represented an unprecedented opportunity to study the genetic basis of mental illness. DeLisi's first meeting with the Galvin family took place in the sterile conference room of a Colorado Springs hospital in the spring of 1985. Mimi attended alone, as Donald Sr. refused to take part in what he saw as an invasion of the family's privacy. The woman who walked into that room looked very little like the vibrant, confident mother who had once presided over Hidden Valley Road's picture-perfect household. Mimi was now in her 60s, her hair completely gray, and her face marked by years of stress and grief. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the fragile dignity of someone who had survived horrors that most people could not even imagine. But when she spoke about her sons, her voice was steady and her memories were precise, as if she had been preparing for this moment for years. "I need to know why this happened to my family," she told DeLisi without introduction. "I need to know if it was something we did or something we failed to do, or if there was never anything we could have done to prevent it. And I need to know if my grandchildren are going to suffer the same fate." DeLisi explained her research methods and the potential benefits of studying the Galvin family's genetic material. But she was careful not to make any promises about finding easy answers or miracle cures. Schizophrenia remained one of the most mysterious and complex mental illnesses, and even with the most advanced research techniques available in the 1980s, the mechanisms that triggered psychotic breaks were poorly understood. But Mimi was desperate for any hope, no matter how small, that her family's suffering might serve some greater purpose. She agreed to participate in DeLisi's research program, and over the next several years, every member of the Galvin family provided blood samples, underwent extensive psychological testing, and submitted to interviews that explored the most painful aspects of their shared history. The research process was both enlightening and devastating for the family members who took part. For the first time, they were forced to confront the full extent of the damage that mental illness had inflicted on their lives. Not just the obvious casualties like Donald Jr. and James, but the subtle ways that fear and trauma had shaped every part of their existence. Margaret and Mary, now adult women with families of their own, had to relive memories of childhood abuse and terror that they had spent years trying to bury. The surviving brothers, who had not developed schizophrenia, lived with the constant fear that their own mental health was just a temporary break, that the genetic time bomb that had destroyed their siblings might still be ticking away inside their own minds. DeLisi's research into the Galvin family's genetic material would eventually lead to groundbreaking discoveries about the hereditary nature of schizophrenia. But the process was slow and often frustrating. For years, the blood samples and psychological profiles generated more questions than answers, offering tempting clues about genetic markers and brain chemistry without providing the clear explanations that the family so desperately wanted. The breakthrough finally came in the early 2000s, when advances in genetic sequencing technology allowed researchers to identify specific mutations that appeared to be linked to schizophrenia susceptibility. In the Galvin family's case, scientists discovered a mutation in the SHNK2 gene on chromosome 11 that was present in all of the affected brothers and their mother, but absent in their father and unaffected siblings. This discovery was revolutionary because it provided the first solid evidence that schizophrenia could be traced to specific genetic abnormalities rather than environmental factors or parenting failures. For Mimi, who had spent decades believing that her controlling parenting style might have caused her son's illnesses, the genetic findings were both a vindication and a tragedy. She had not caused their mental illness, but she had unknowingly passed the genetic predisposition on to half of her children. The research also led to important discoveries about brain development and the role of certain nutrients in preventing mental illness. Dr. Robert Friedman, working with data from the Galvin family and other research subjects, identified connections between specific brain receptors and schizophrenia symptoms. His work eventually led to recommendations that pregnant women take choline supplements to support fetal brain development and potentially reduce the risk of schizophrenia in their children. But for the Galvin family members who were still alive to see these scientific advances, the discoveries felt bittersweet. The research might help future generations avoid the horrors that had destroyed their family. But it came too late to save the brothers who had already been lost to madness and death. By the time researchers were making their genetic discoveries, the Galvin family had been scattered by decades of tragedy and trauma. Donald Jr. spent his final years in a nursing home, his once brilliant mind reduced to fragments by medications and the progression of his illness. He died in 2010, a forgotten shadow of the promising young man who had once been his family's greatest hope. James had died years earlier from complications related to the powerful antipsychotic medications that were supposed to control his symptoms, but instead slowly poisoned his body. His death was officially ruled natural causes, but his family knew that the drugs that kept him functional had ultimately killed him, just as surely as his mental illness had destroyed his mind. Of the 6 brothers who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, only 2 remained alive: Matthew and Peter. Matthew lived in an assisted care facility, his artistic talents still occasionally evident in the paintings and drawings he created during his clear periods. Peter had been in and out of institutions for decades, his diagnosis shifting between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder as doctors struggled to understand the exact nature of his mental illness. The surviving healthy brothers, John, Michael, Richard, and Mark, had all managed to build relatively normal lives despite the trauma of their childhood. They had careers, marriages, and children of their own, but they remained haunted by survivor's guilt and the constant fear that mental illness might still claim them or their offspring. Margaret and Mary, the two sisters who had endured years of abuse and terror, had perhaps the most complex relationships with their family's legacy. Both had become advocates for mental health awareness and research, channeling their pain into efforts to help other families facing similar challenges. But they also struggled with the ongoing effects of childhood trauma and the impossible task of maintaining relationships with brothers who had both protected and terrorized them. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror on Hidden Valley Road intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The story of the Galvin family took another devastating turn in the spring of 2001 when James, who had been living in a supervised group home after years of institutionalization, was found dead in his room from what appeared to be an accidental overdose of his psychiatric medications. The official investigation concluded that James had become confused about his dosing schedule and had taken several days' worth of pills at once, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence among patients with severe mental illness. But his sister Mary, who had maintained a relationship with James despite the abuse she had suffered at his hands, suspected that his death might not have been entirely accidental. In the weeks before he died, James had been experiencing what his doctors called a medication breakthrough, a period when his symptoms returned despite supposedly therapeutic drug levels. He had been talking obsessively about voices that told him he was poisoning his family just by being alive, and about his desire to stop the damage he was causing to everyone who loved him. Whether James's death was a deliberate suicide or a tragic accident, it marked the end of one of the most tormented lives in a family that had known more than its share of suffering. His funeral was attended only by immediate family members, and the local newspaper's brief obituary made no mention of his mental illness or the circumstances of his death. The loss of James hit Mimi particularly hard because, despite everything he had done during his illness, she had never stopped believing that her son was still somewhere inside the mind that schizophrenia had claimed. She had visited him regularly at the group home, bringing home cooked meals and photo albums filled with pictures from happier times, hoping to spark some recognition or connection that would prove her real son was still alive inside his damaged brain. After James' death, Mimi began to withdraw from the world, spending most of her time alone in the house on Hidden Valley Road, surrounded by memories of the family that had once filled its rooms with laughter and music. She continued to participate in DeLisi's research program, but her enthusiasm for the scientific discoveries had dimmed considerably. The genetic breakthroughs and potential treatments felt increasingly irrelevant when weighed against the reality of her daily grief. Donald Sr. had died several years earlier from a heart attack, never having fully acknowledged the extent of his family's mental health crisis or his own role in the dynamics that had made their suffering even worse. His death left Mimi truly alone with the ghosts of Hidden Valley Road, a living monument to the dreams that had been destroyed by forces that no one fully understood. As the children of the surviving Galvin siblings reached adolescence and young adulthood, the family faced a new kind of terror. The possibility that the genetic predisposition to schizophrenia might manifest in the next generation. Every mood swing, every period of teenage rebellion, every sign of stress or unusual behavior was scrutinized for evidence that the family curse was continuing its devastating march through time. Margaret's daughter Kate grew up knowing about her family's history, but trying to live a normal life despite the shadow it cast over every major milestone. When she reached her late teens, the age when schizophrenia symptoms typically first appear, both she and her mother watched anxiously for any sign that the genetic time bomb might be activating. Kate's college years were marked by an almost obsessive attention to her own mental health. She avoided drugs and alcohol, maintained strict sleep schedules, and sought therapy at the first sign of stress or anxiety. When she occasionally heard her name being called when no one was around, an experience that might have been dismissed as imagination by most people, she immediately contacted mental health professionals to rule out auditory hallucinations. The hypervigilance that characterized Kate's approach to her own mental health was both necessary and exhausting. She lived with the constant awareness that the genes she carried might betray her at any moment, transforming her from a normal young woman into another casualty of the Galvin family's genetic legacy. Mary's children faced similar challenges, growing up with the knowledge that their family history made them statistically more likely to develop serious mental illness. Family gatherings became exercises in carefully controlled emotion, with everyone hyper-aware of how their behavior might be interpreted as early warning signs of psychological breakdown. The fear was not entirely unfounded. While none of the third generation developed full-blown schizophrenia, several of them struggled with depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues that might have been manageable in a different family context, but felt like harbingers of doom given their genetic inheritance. In 2017, Mimi Galvin died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 93, finally joining the sons she had lost decades earlier. Her death marked the end of an era for the surviving family members, who gathered at Hidden Valley Road one last time to settle her affairs and decide what to do with the house that had witnessed so much joy and suffering. The house itself had changed very little since the 1970s, and walking through its rooms was like stepping back in time to the peak years of the family's crisis. The kitchen, where Mimi had prepared thousands of meals for her 12 children, still bore scorch marks from a fire that Donald Jr. had set during one of his psychotic episodes. The basement, where several of the boys had been locked during their violent outbursts, still contained restraints that Donald Sr. had installed in a desperate attempt to protect the rest of the family. Most disturbing of all was Mimi's bedroom, where she had maintained a shrine to her lost sons that included their childhood photographs, report cards, and letters they had written from various mental institutions over the years. The room was frozen in time, a testament to a mother's refusal to let go of the children she had known before mental illness stole them away. The surviving family members ultimately decided to sell the house, but not before documenting its contents for researchers who were still studying the Galvin family's case. Every room was photographed, every document was cataloged, and every piece of furniture was examined for clues about how 12 children had lived in such close quarters, while half of them descended into madness. The scientific legacy of the Galvin family's participation in psychiatric research continues to influence mental health treatment and genetic counseling to this day. The discoveries made through studying their DNA have contributed to a better understanding of how schizophrenia develops and have informed new approaches to prevention and treatment that have helped countless other families avoid similar tragedies. But for the surviving Galvin siblings, the scientific achievements feel like cold comfort when weighed against the human cost of their family's contribution to medical knowledge. They participated in research studies for decades, submitting to invasive tests and painful interviews in the hope that their suffering might prevent other families from experiencing similar horrors. The genetic discoveries that resulted from their participation have indeed helped advance the field of psychiatric medicine. But they came too late to save the 6 brothers who were lost to mental illness. Despite everything they had endured, the surviving Galvin siblings maintained connections to each other that spoke to the deep bonds forged during their childhood trauma. They gathered regularly to remember their lost brothers, not as the violent, mentally ill men they had become, but as the children they had been before schizophrenia claimed them. These family reunions were complex affairs filled with love and grief in equal measure. The siblings would share memories of Donald Jr.'s athletic achievements, James' musical talents, and Brian's gentle nature during his lucid periods. They would laugh about childhood pranks and family vacations, carefully avoiding the darker memories that still had the power to traumatize them decades later. But the unspoken presence of their dead and damaged brothers hung over every gathering like a shadow. Empty chairs at the dinner table served as reminders of the family members who should have been there, and conversations would sometimes trail off into silence as someone remembered a particular incident or expression that brought the past flooding back with overwhelming intensity. Margaret struggled perhaps the most with these family gatherings because her memories of childhood were so thoroughly contaminated by trauma. She had loved her brothers desperately during their healthy periods, but she had also lived in terror of them during their psychotic episodes. The cognitive dissonance of grieving for people who had both protected and victimized her created a psychological burden that no amount of therapy seemed able to fully resolve. Mary, the youngest, had developed a different coping mechanism. She had become the family's unofficial historian, collecting photographs, documents, and stories about their shared past in an effort to preserve the positive memories alongside the traumatic ones. Her home was filled with carefully organized albums that told the story of the Galvin family's rise and fall. From the early pictures of 12 beautiful children playing in their Colorado backyard to the final institutional photographs of brothers who had become strangers to themselves and their families. The surviving brothers, John, Michael, Richard, and Mark, had each found their own ways to process the survivor's guilt that came with being the ones who escaped their family's genetic curse. John had become a successful businessman, channeling his need for control into building a company that employed hundreds of people. Michael had devoted himself to his children, determined to give them the stable, loving childhood that had been stolen from him and his siblings. Richard had perhaps the most complex relationship with his family's legacy because he had shown early signs of mental illness during his teenage years, but had somehow managed to avoid the complete breakdown that claimed his brothers. He lived with the constant awareness that his sanity might be temporary, that the genetic predisposition to schizophrenia could still activate despite his having reached middle age without a major psychotic episode. Mark, as one of the youngest boys, had witnessed the full scope of his family's descent into chaos while still being too young to fully understand what was happening. His memories of childhood were a confusing mixture of normal family activities and terrifying incidents that had taught him to be constantly alert to danger, even in apparently safe situations. The impact of the Galvin family's mental health crisis extended far beyond the immediate family members to affect friends, neighbors, romantic partners, and colleagues who had witnessed various aspects of their tragedy. Over the years, Colorado Springs in the 1960s and 1970s was still a relatively small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the Galvin family's problems had been impossible to hide completely despite their desperate attempts to maintain a facade of normality. Former teachers at the local schools remembered Donald Jr., James, and Brian as bright, promising students whose potential had been destroyed by forces that no one understood at the time. These educators carried their own burden of guilt and confusion, wondering if they had missed early warning signs that might have led to earlier intervention and different outcomes. The young women who had dated the Galvin brothers during their late teens and early 20s had their own traumatic memories to process. Several had experienced frightening incidents that they had initially dismissed as isolated episodes of jealousy or stress, only to learn years later that they had been witnessing the early stages of severe mental illness. Nancy's family in particular had been devastated not only by her murder, but by the realization that the charming young man they had welcomed into their home had been capable of such violence. Her parents spent years searching for warning signs they might have missed, explanations that might have allowed them to protect their daughter from a fate that seemed to come out of nowhere. The broader Colorado Springs community struggled to make sense of a tragedy that challenged their assumptions about mental illness, family dysfunction, and the reliability of appearances. The Galvins had been held up as an example of American family success, making their fall from grace particularly shocking and difficult to process. Local mental health professionals found themselves confronting the limitations of their knowledge and treatment approaches when faced with a family that defied conventional understanding. The standard interventions that worked for individual patients seemed woefully inadequate when applied to a situation where half of a family's children were simultaneously experiencing severe psychiatric crisis. In 2020, author Robert Coker published Hidden Valley Road, a comprehensive account of the Galvin family's story that brought their case to national attention for the first time. The book's publication marked a turning point in how the surviving family members related to their own history, transforming them from private victims of a genetic tragedy into public advocates for mental health awareness and research. The process of cooperating with Coker's research had been both therapeutic and re-traumatizing for the surviving siblings. They had been forced to revisit their most painful memories in exhaustive detail, but they had also gained a new perspective on their experiences through conversations with researchers, mental health professionals, and other families who had faced similar challenges. Margaret in particular found that participating in the book project helped her understand her mother's behavior during the family's crisis years. For decades, she had blamed Mimi for failing to protect her and Mary from their brother's abuse. But learning about the limited resources and knowledge available to families dealing with mental illness in the 1960s and 1970s had given her a more compassionate view of her mother's impossible situation. The book's publication also brought unexpected connections with other families who had experienced multiple cases of schizophrenia. The Galvins learned that they were not alone in their suffering, that other parents had watched helplessly as mental illness destroyed their children's lives, and that other siblings had struggled with survivor's guilt and the fear of genetic inheritance. But perhaps most importantly, the book helped establish the Galvin family's suffering as a meaningful contribution to scientific knowledge rather than simply a series of random tragedies. The genetic discoveries that had resulted from decades of research on their DNA were already helping other families receive earlier interventions and more effective treatments. Despite all the scientific advances that have resulted from studying the Galvin family's case, fundamental questions about schizophrenia remain unanswered. Researchers still don't fully understand why some people with genetic predispositions develop the illness while others remain healthy, or why symptoms manifest so differently from one patient to another. The surviving Galvin family members continued to participate in ongoing research studies, providing updated medical information and DNA samples as new technologies become available. They do so not because they expect to benefit personally from future discoveries, but because they hope their continued cooperation might prevent other families from experiencing similar devastation. Matthew and Peter, the two surviving brothers with schizophrenia, remain in assisted living facilities where they receive round-the-clock care. Matthew occasionally shows flashes of the artistic talent that had made him special as a young man, creating paintings and drawings that hint at the person he might have been in different circumstances. Peter's condition has stabilized somewhat with age, and he is able to maintain limited contact with his siblings during their supervised visits. The question of what triggers schizophrenia in genetically predisposed individuals remains one of the most important unsolved mysteries in psychiatric medicine. Environmental factors, stress, drug use, and traumatic experiences all seem to play roles in determining whether genetic vulnerability becomes active illness, but the exact mechanisms remain unclear. For the Galvin family, this uncertainty means that the threat of mental illness continues to hang over the next generation like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. Kate and the other grandchildren live with the knowledge that they carry genes that could betray them at any moment, transforming them from healthy young adults into patients struggling with one of the most devastating mental illnesses known to medical science. The scientific discoveries that emerged from studying the Galvin family came at an almost unimaginable human cost. 6 promising young men lost their minds, their futures, and ultimately their lives to a disease that medical science is still struggling to understand. 2 parents watched their carefully constructed American dream crumble into a nightmare of violence, madness, and death. 4 surviving siblings carry psychological scars that will never fully heal, and 2 sisters endured years of abuse that shaped every aspect of their adult lives. The genetic research that vindicated Mimi's parenting and identified specific mutations associated with schizophrenia risk came too late to save any of the brothers who were lost to mental illness. The treatment advances and prevention strategies that resulted from studying their case will help future families, but they cannot restore the decades of suffering that the Galvins endured while medical science slowly caught up to the reality of their situation. In many ways, the Galvin family story represents both the promise and the limitations of scientific progress. Their willingness to participate in research studies despite their own pain and trauma has contributed to genuine advances in understanding and treating mental illness. But the pace of scientific discovery is measured in decades, while human suffering unfolds in real time, day by day and year by year. The surviving family members take some comfort in knowing that their losses have meaning beyond personal tragedy, that the brothers who were claimed by schizophrenia did not suffer and die for nothing, but they also live with the knowledge that medical science's current understanding of mental illness remains frustratingly incomplete, leaving too many questions unanswered and too many families vulnerable to similar devastation. The house on Hidden Valley Road was eventually sold to a young family who knew nothing of its history when they moved in. The new owners found it to be a beautiful property with stunning mountain views and spacious rooms that seemed perfect for raising children. They painted over the scorch marks in the kitchen, removed the restraints from the basement, and filled the rooms with new furniture and the sounds of healthy, happy children. But some of the neighbors remember what happened in that house during the 1960s and 1970s, and they sometimes wonder if the new family can sense the residual pain that seems to linger in certain rooms. There are no ghosts walking the halls of Hidden Valley Road, no supernatural explanations for the tragedy that unfolded there. The horror was entirely human, entirely real, and entirely rooted in the cruel lottery of genetic inheritance. The basement, where several Galvin brothers spent their most violent periods, still bears subtle signs of their presence. Scratches on the walls where fingernails clawed at paint and plaster, dents in the concrete where heads and fists struck surfaces with desperate force. The new owners have covered most of these marks with fresh paint and decorative panels, but they remain as permanent reminders of the suffering that once filled these spaces. Mimi's bedroom, where she maintained her shrine to her lost sons for decades, has been converted into a cheerful nursery where the new family's baby sleeps peacefully each night. The walls that once displayed photographs of 12 Galvin children now hold colorful pictures of farm animals and alphabet letters, symbols of hope and innocence that seem to push back against the darkness of the room's history. Even with all the scientific research and genetic discoveries that have resulted from studying the Galvin family's case, fundamental questions about their tragedy remain unanswered. Why did schizophrenia manifest so dramatically in this particular family? What environmental or psychological factors might have triggered the genetic predispositions that 6 brothers carried? Could earlier intervention have changed the outcomes for any of them? The timing of the brothers' breakdown suggests that something about the family dynamics or environment may have contributed to the activation of their genetic vulnerabilities. Donald Jr.'s initial psychotic break occurred during his first semester of college when he was separated from his family for the first time. James' symptoms emerged during his senior year of high school when he was under pressure to live up to his older brother's achievements while watching that same brother's descent into madness. The pattern suggests that stress, expectations, and family dynamics may have played crucial roles in determining when and how each brother's mental illness manifested. But untangling the complex interactions between genetics, environment, and individual psychology remains one of the greatest challenges in psychiatric research. For the surviving family members, these unanswered questions represent more than academic curiosity. They are sources of ongoing guilt, and self-doubt. Margaret and Mary sometimes wonder if their presence in the house as potential victims created additional stress for their brothers. The surviving brothers question whether they could have done more to protect their siblings or recognize warning signs earlier. Mimi spent her final years tortured by similar questions. Despite the genetic research that had vindicated her parenting, she continued to search her memories for moments when different choices might have led to different outcomes. The scientific evidence that schizophrenia was primarily genetic rather than environmental provided intellectual relief, but could not ease the emotional burden of a mother who had watched 6 of her children disappear into madness. Today, more than 5 decades after the first Galvin brother showed signs of mental illness, the surviving family members continue their vigilant watch for symptoms in the next generation. Every family gathering includes subtle assessments of mental health. Every phone call carries a potential for devastating news, and every milestone birthday in the late teens and early 20s brings renewed anxiety about genetic time bombs that may still be ticking. The grandchildren, who carry Galvin DNA, have learned to live with this scrutiny as a fact of life, understanding that their family's love comes wrapped in fear and hypervigilance. They submit to regular mental health evaluations, avoid substances that might trigger psychotic episodes, and maintain detailed records of their moods and behaviors that would seem obsessive in any other family context. This constant monitoring has created a strange form of psychological pressure that may itself be harmful to the young people who are trying to build normal lives despite their genetic inheritance. The fear of developing schizophrenia sometimes becomes so overwhelming that it creates anxiety and depression that require treatment, adding another layer of complexity to an already fraught situation. Kate Galvin, Margaret's daughter, has become particularly thoughtful about these dynamics as she considers whether to have children of her own. The genetic counseling she has received indicates that her risk of passing on schizophrenia susceptibility is significant but not overwhelming. But the decision feels impossibly weighty given her family's history. The question of whether to continue the family line, knowing that future children might carry the same genetic vulnerabilities that destroyed 6 of her uncles, represents the kind of moral complexity that previous generations could never have imagined. Science has given the Galvin family knowledge about their genetic risks, but it has not made the decisions any easier. This mystery shows us how thin the line between sanity and madness truly is, and how genetics can shape destiny in ways that seem almost cruelly arbitrary. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoy this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.